3 days ago, the Chancellor of Germany walked onto a stage in Munich and said 8 words that no Western leader has ever said publicly. This order no longer exists. He was not talking about a policy. He was not talking about a trade deal. He was talking about the entire international system that the West built after World War II, the rules-based order, the American-led architecture of alliances, institutions, and agreements that has governed global security and trade for 80 years. The Chancellor of the largest economy in Europe stood in front of 50 heads of state, 1,000 delegates from 115 countries, and said, "It is over." Not eroding, not under pressure. Over. And the room did not gasp. Nobody pushed back. Nobody disagreed, because everyone in that room already knew. They had known for months, and the evidence was not in speeches or reports. It was in plane tickets. In the first 6 weeks of 2026, a parade of world leaders has flown to Beijing. The Prime Minister of Canada, first visit in 9 years. He signed a deal slashing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China reopening a $4 billion agricultural market. Within 24 hours, the president threatened 100% tariffs on everything Canadian. 2 weeks later, the Prime Minister of Britain walked into the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. First visit by a British leader in 8 years. He brought more than 50 representatives of British businesses and cultural institutions. Over 4 days, they signed £2.2 billion in export deals, £2.3 billion in market access agreements, and hundreds of millions in direct Chinese investment into Britain. China cut whiskey tariffs in half, from 10% to 5%. Chinese companies announced new headquarters in London and Liverpool. Energy storage manufacturer Haithaiyum committed £200 million and 300 jobs. And China granted British citizens visa-free entry for up to 30 days. 12 intergovernmental cooperation documents were signed, covering trade, agriculture, finance, healthcare, media, education, and law enforcement. The British Prime Minister called it a consistent, pragmatic partnership. China's president called it a new chapter of cooperation. And London explicitly said the trip was in the national interest, regardless of how Washington might react. Then came France. The president has publicly discussed deepening engagement with China and is preparing his own high-level visit. Germany, the largest economy in Europe, met with Chinese officials on the sidelines of Munich and is recalibrating its entire trade relationship. India is moving in every direction at once. The Chinese Communist Party delegation arrived in New Delhi on January 11th, the first since the 2020 Galwan Valley clashes that killed soldiers on both sides. They met with ruling party and civil society leaders. India's national security advisor is expected to visit China soon, and simultaneously, India signed a trade agreement with Britain and is negotiating another with the European Union. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 countries representing 700 million people, is recalibrating its entire trade orientation. Even the Gulf states are deepening energy and infrastructure partnerships with Beijing, and this is not happening because China suddenly became more attractive. It is happening because the United States became less reliable. That distinction is the entire story. For 70 years, the global economic system operated on a simple premise. The United States would lead, and in exchange for that leadership, it would provide stability, stable trade rules, stable currency, stable alliances, stable access to the largest consumer market on Earth. Countries organized their economies around that stability. They built supply chains that ran through American ports. They priced their commodities in American dollars. They trained their diplomats to negotiate in American frameworks. And then, over the course of 12 months, that stability disappeared. 25% tariffs on Canada, the closest ally. Tariffs on Mexico, the closest trading partner to the South. Tariffs on the European Union, the closest civilizational partner. Tariffs on Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, Brazil, allies and partners across every continent. And not through legislation, not through negotiation, through emergency declarations. Using a law from 1977, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that was written to sanction hostile nations during genuine emergencies, repurposed to tax the imports of friendly countries without congressional approval. 2 lower courts have already ruled this illegal. The Supreme Court heard arguments in November, and in 3 days, February 20th, 2026, the justices returned from recess. The ruling could come at any time after that. $133 billion in potential refunds. The legal foundation of the entire tariff architecture, hanging by a thread, but the legal question is almost secondary now, because the damage is already done. Not to trade flows, those can be repaired. The damage is to trust. And trust, once broken at this systemic level, does not come back on a court schedule. The Munich Security Conference happens every February in a 5-star hotel in the center of the city. It is the largest independent forum for international security policy in the world. 50 heads of state, over 50 leaders of international organizations, more than 100 think tanks, 270 side events. And this year's theme was not a question. It was a diagnosis, under destruction. So when the chancellor took the stage on opening day, he did not soften the message. He said the unipolar moment, the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall when the United States stood alone as the world's only superpower, has long passed. He said Europe's freedom is no longer a given. He said even the United States will not be powerful enough to go it alone. And then he disclosed something that sent a separate shockwave through the room. He said he had begun talks with the president of France on European nuclear deterrence. Not NATO nuclear sharing. European nuclear deterrence. An independent European capacity to defend itself without relying on American guarantees. That conversation has not happened at the leadership level since the 1960s. The fact that it is happening now tells you everything about where the relationship stands. The American Secretary of State arrived in Munich and tried to reassure the room. He said the United States does not need to abandon the system of international cooperation it authored. He said institutions like NATO and the United Nations must be reformed, not dismantled. He received a standing ovation, but the standing ovation was not for what he said. It was for the contrast with what happened last year. Last year, the vice president came to Munich and lectured Europe. He criticized their immigration policies. He questioned their commitment to free speech. He warned of threats from within. He told a room full of European leaders that their greatest danger was not Russia, not economic collapse, not climate change, but their own internal politics. European officials described it as the most hostile American address in the conference's 60-year history. The Munich Security Report, which sets the intellectual framework for the conference each year, used a phrase to describe the current moment that no previous edition had ever used: wrecking ball politics. The report identified the current American administration as the most prominent actor pursuing destruction over reform of the existing international order. Not Russia, not China, the United States, written by a German institution that has been one of the strongest pillars of the transatlantic alliance since the Cold War. So when the Secretary of State came this year and simply spoke respectfully, the bar was so low that basic diplomatic courtesy felt like a breakthrough. One European diplomat told reporters the standing ovation was relief, not agreement. And the EU's chief diplomat made it explicit. When asked whether Europe needed saving by the United States, she said, "The EU does not need saving." Meanwhile, beneath the speeches, the structural shift was accelerating. A CNBC analysis published during the conference laid out the pattern in stark terms. The world is moving back to China. And unlike the last time, when countries moved toward China because of its accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, this time, the movement is away from the United States. The catalyst is not Chinese reform. The catalyst is American unpredictability. 71% of Germans now view the United States as an adversary, not a competitor. An adversary. That number was in the single digits a decade ago. British public opinion has shifted in the same direction. Canadian public opinion has shifted further and faster than anyone predicted. And the diplomatic foot traffic tells the story more clearly than any poll. In January, the Canadian Prime Minister flew to Beijing and signed a landmark deal, lowering tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for China reopening a $4 billion canola market. Within days, the British Prime Minister was in Beijing for his own meetings. India signed a trade agreement with Britain and is negotiating another with the European Union, building bridges in every direction except toward Washington. The Gulf states are deepening energy partnerships with China. African nations, 20 of which the World Bank classifies as fragile or conflict-affected, are increasingly looking to Beijing for infrastructure investment that Western institutions have not provided. And the numbers behind these visits are not symbolic. China posted a record $1.2 trillion trade surplus in 2025. Its exports to the world grew, while American trade volumes with allied nations shrank. Global ocean container volumes to the United States fell 14% year over year. American imports from China fell 28%. But Chinese trade with the rest of the world increased. The tariffs did not shrink China. They shrunk America's share of global trade. And the money that used to flow into dollar-denominated assets is finding other destinations. Gold hit $5,000 an ounce in February 2026. Central banks purchased 863 tons of gold in 2025, buying real assets and reducing dollar exposure. The World Gold Council expects purchases to remain near that level in 2026. This is not a gold rally driven by jewelry demand. Jewelry sales actually fell 18% globally because prices are too high. This is a gold rally driven by central banks and sovereign wealth funds deliberately diversifying away from the dollar. When the German chancellor says the order no longer exists, and central banks around the world are buying gold at record pace, and allied leaders are flying to Beijing one after another, those are not separate stories. They are the same story. The architecture that held the global economy together for 80 years is being replaced, not by a new architecture, by a series of bilateral and regional arrangements that route around the United States rather than through it. And here's the part that makes this story truly extraordinary. The American president himself is scheduled to fly to Beijing in April. He accepted the invitation in November after meeting China's president in South Korea. The Treasury Secretary told CNBC there could be as many as 4 meetings between the two leaders in 2026. Beijing in April, a state visit to Washington, a possible meeting at the G20 summit, and another at the APEC summit in Shenzhen. China is hosting the world. First, it hosted Canada's Prime Minister, then Britain's, then India's delegation, then it will host the American president. And a CNBC analysis published during the Munich conference laid out exactly what this means. After hosting America's allies, China will host the American president, reinforcing the narrative that global diplomacy still converges on Beijing. In Beijing's telling, the Middle Kingdom is back. But this is not 2001 when countries moved toward China because of opportunity. This is 2026, and countries are moving toward China because of necessity. Because the alternative, relying solely on the United States, has become too unpredictable. Canada is building trade corridors to China, Europe, and the Pacific. Europe is activating its own mutual defense clause for the first time, the EU Treaty's Article 42, Paragraph 7, which commits member states to aid each other if attacked, independent of NATO. The European Commission President said at Munich, "Mutual defense is not optional for the EU. It is an obligation within our own treaty." India is signing deals with everyone simultaneously. The Gulf states are pricing energy in multiple currencies. And the Supreme Court is about to rule on whether the legal tool that enabled this entire tariff regime was ever legal in the first place. If the court strikes down IEEPA tariffs, the administration loses its most flexible trade weapon. If it upholds them, the diplomatic exodus continues, because the damage was never about the tariffs themselves. It was about the signal the tariffs sent, that the United States will use economic force against its own allies without warning, without negotiation, and without legal foundation that its own courts will uphold. And in either scenario, the midterm elections are 9 months away. 60% of Americans disapprove of the tariffs. 6 Republicans in the House just voted to terminate them. The Senate has already passed similar resolutions. And every swing district lawmaker is calculating whether loyalty to the trade policy is worth the political cost of higher prices at home. The world is not waiting for the United States to decide. It is already moving. Every bilateral deal signed in Beijing, every defense conversation in Munich, every ton of gold purchased by a central bank, these are not reactions to headlines. They are structural decisions that take years to reverse. Canada is not going to unsign its deal with China if tariffs are lifted tomorrow. Europe is not going to cancel its nuclear deterrence discussions because of one reassuring speech. India is not going to stop diversifying because the Supreme Court issues a ruling. The rearrangement is underway. And the question is no longer whether it will happen. The question is how far it goes and what it means for you, because this is not abstract geopolitics. When allied nations route their trade around the United States, the cost hits American consumers first. Fewer imports from trusted partners mean higher prices on shelves. When central banks reduce dollar reserves, the borrowing cost for American debt rises, which means higher mortgage rates, higher car loan rates, higher credit card rates. When European allies begin building independent defense capabilities, the justification for American military spending shifts, and the budget fights in Congress get uglier. The Joint Economic Committee estimated that tariffs alone are costing the average American household $1,200 a year. But that number does not include the second-order effects: the trade diversion, the supply chain rewiring, the investment that now flows to London and Beijing instead of New York and Detroit. Those effects are just beginning. There is a historical parallel that very few people are talking about. In 2017, after the first round of tariff threats, China's president traveled to Davos and gave a speech defending free trade and globalization. He was briefly cast as the alternative, a champion of open markets, while the United States retreated. But China failed to live up to that promise. It ushered in the era of wolf warrior diplomacy, aggressive, confrontational, punitive, and the world pulled back. The question today is whether China makes the same mistake twice, because the window is open again. Every leader flying to Beijing is not pledging loyalty to China. They are hedging against American unpredictability. They are building options, not alliances. And China knows the difference. If Beijing overreaches, if it uses this moment to push coercive demands on Taiwan, to restrict market access, to weaponize rare earths again, the window closes. But if it offers what the United States is currently withholding, stable trade rules, predictable access, long-term agreements, then the shift becomes permanent. And that is what makes the next 90 days the most consequential in a generation. The Supreme Court ruling, any day after February 20th. The Kuzma Review, July 1st. The American president's visit to Beijing, April. The midterm elections, November. 4 events, 4 chances for the architecture to either stabilize or fracture further. And right now, every central bank buying gold, every leader booking a flight to Beijing, every European defense minister discussing nuclear deterrence, they are all making the same calculation. The old system is not coming back. The only question is, what replaces it? To understand what comes next, and how it affects your savings, your job, your cost of living, and the price of everything you buy, make sure you are following this channel. Because the world just made its decision. And most people have no idea it already happened.